We talked about the promise and the blessing of work, that it is not only created by God in the beginning, but we saw from Psalm 104 that it's part of his ongoing creative purposes for the world. And that includes, right in the middle of the psalm, it includes human labor. This week we turn to the other side of the equation, which is the effects of the fall on work. And we're going to deal with the fall under the category of three other words beginning with F: finitude, frustration, and futility. And we've got three texts for that. So I've got a little visual here. Hootalink was a region up in the, it's either in the Northwest Territories or one of those places in Canada where virtually no one ever goes. Hootalinqua, which is the convergence of the blue waters of the Yukon and the brown muddy waters of the Teslin. And you can just get a glimpse here of the Teslin and its murkiness and the wonderful blue waters of the Yukon. And that's the image I want to suggest is very helpful for thinking about our work. It's not just that work is all right. It's a mixed bag and in a world that is just kind of off on its own apart from God's care. No, we've got the kind of beauty and joy of human labor that we talked about last week, symbolized by the blue waters of the Yukon. But in that same stream bed, we've got the murky, confused brown waters of the Teslin. One of the most beautiful but nonetheless sobering psalms in the whole Bible, Psalm 90, well known to us all, I would suspect, if not in the original, then in Isaac Watts' hymn, "O God, our help in ages past, our hope for days to come." What we're going to see as we go through this cycle of finitude, meaning the shortness, brevity of life, frustration, and futility, is in one sense is going to be an escalation or an intensifying of the grim news that finitude is something we might just sort of accept, and it's a bit unfortunate but not too bad. Frustration gets things a little ratcheted up, and when time we get to futility and what's the use, we're really at the end. On the other hand, we'll see that in these three passages we're going to examine today, that these things also flow in and out of one another. Finitude, the brevity of life, and Moses doesn't explicitly connect it to work at this point. Nonetheless, the psalm, as you may remember, is going to conclude with a specific word about human labor. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us, establish the work of our hands for us. So work is very much on Moses' mind as he thinks about the finitude, the shortness, the brevity of human life. He rightly begins by extolling the infinite grandeur of the living God, that before the hills in order stood, God was there. The age of the world is meant to weigh heavily upon us as a way of beginning to grope towards God's eternal nature and glory. But we're dust. We're dust. And so what we do eventually kind of crumbles away. We can't accomplish all that we would want to accomplish, right? Our years just run out. Whatever we do compared to what God has done in his eternal glory is quickly going to fade into the dust along with ourselves, right? So at this point we kind of give a little sigh. Save your breath, because you're going to need some bigger sighs as we move forward. And already we get the sense in Psalm 90 that maybe something's not quite right. Right? So finitude, a fixed limit to one's self and one's work, is in one sense just part of being a created thing. Right? We're never going to match God's infinity. Even if we were to last forever from here on in, which I hope we will, and even if we were to work forever, assuming that's a positive thing later on, unlike now where it's a mixed bag, even if that were the case, we'd still have this deficit of not having existed, right? So we're never going to reach God's eternity. Nonetheless, we don't experience our lack of ability to finish things because of our finitude simply as the way it is. And Moses again hints at this more than hints perhaps in verse 7, we're consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. And we see that even the limits placed on us, which in the abstract would make perfect sense, we're created beings, so we have limits, something's not quite right. Well, we certainly know where to turn to discover part of the reason why things aren't right, and that is in the narrative of the fall in Genesis 3. And I'm trusting you know the wiles of the serpent, both from the text and firsthand. No, not disparaging anybody. That's true of all of us. Even if the details have differed, the end result is the same. So, a well-known story, but we want to pick out here, of course, the curse on the ground. And this is a very interesting question as to what exactly is going on here. Because you'll remember that last week we talked about the wildness of the world, which is part of God's good ordering of the creation, and which was meant to be subdued through human ingenuity, presumably fueled by the guidance of the Holy Spirit, right? So the wildness of creation, a certain degree of resistance that would need to be overcome, was part of the original plan, right? And I think Eden itself, the Garden of Delights, as we call it, and as the Bible itself labels it, this Garden of Delights may have been a little easier to manage, just grabbing your mangoes for your mango smoothie and breakfast or whatever it is. But still, they were meant to go out into a world which was still wild, but was still good in its wildness, right? So you got to balance the sense that a certain degree of resistance from the natural world was to be expected versus this statement that the ground is cursed, thorns, thistles, mosquitoes, right, and the rest. If you look at things that way, then you don't necessarily have to say that the curse consists in a disruption of the natural order. Now, I admit that's a possibility, right? So you could have Eden created and the world's a certain way, and then because of the curse, God gets right into the middle of things and just makes it completely different. On the other hand, I think it's still acceptable biblically to imagine that the world is what it was, but our experience of the environment is what's cursed because of our dislocation from God. So that things we would have been able to overcome, right, become insuperable obstacles. The key thing is, however that situation arose, right, we know it's a situation we're in, that our labor is under the curse, that it produces thorns and thistles, eat the plants of the field, that our purposes are forever frustrated by the situation arising from the fall. And I'd say this in two ways, the second of which is only implicit in the text, but I think is actually the more important one. First of all, we of course face problems with the natural world. At the same time, though, I would argue the worst things about our work really lie a bit hidden here in the initial response to God. It's the disruption of relationships, the relationship between God and humanity. So now we're running away from Him, trying to get as far as we can, even though He's the only one who can help us have productive labor. And then the estrangement between people, that God gives Eve as a good gift to Adam, and the first thing He does when things go awry is to blame her, right? To kind of sever in some regards that relationship. And even though God is there in His grace, the fact He comes to speak with them, the fact He clothes them, the fact He gives them a home, albeit one east of Eden, those are all signs of God's ongoing grace. But this disruption is what really messes up our work. That's why of all the sins that beset the workplace that I could talk about today, that bring frustration in our labor, I would want to highlight, I think above all, bad management. I think part of the burden of the Genesis narrative of the curse is this is just a pervasive, systemic problem that you're just going to have to work through, that not only your finitude, but the frustration you get when things around you are going wrong is part of the reality of the workplace. And what makes it even more frustrating is on those good days or those good moments, you get this taste of what labor is meant to be like and how good it is and fruitful and productive. And then literally the next day you might go in and the new manager's not talking to you for 6 weeks. Okay, well, let's go to our third category, futility. And we'll actually want to have an instance of workplace violence as part of our transition. Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. So Cain was very angry. You remember this? Calls him out into the field, their workplace, and kills Abel. Abel's name sounds like the Hebrew word for breath, hebel, right? Just the sense that he's here today, he's gone tomorrow. And so that frustration resulting from the fall now, as it were, puts finitude in a new and negative light, right? What might have been a natural lifespan, and then again, who knows, God just gives you to eat from the tree of life and you live forever. Now that life is truncated, and here it's cut short well before its time. And so Abel's name, Hebel, the breath, the vaporousness of existence, is given its first and arguably most poignant illustration here. The reason I introduce Abel's name is that's how the book of Ecclesiastes begins. Hebel, Hebel, the words of the teacher, son of David, meaningless, meaningless as a teacher. So I want to talk about this translation of this word, which is going to be quite important for our discussion now. Meaningless is not necessarily the best word to use here. Let me explain why. Because meaningless can suggest that the teacher, Solomon, is sort of like some beret-wearing, chain-smoking French intellectual of the 1930s, sitting there saying, there is no God, there is no meaning or purpose to life, it's just complete chaos. So we smoke our cigarettes, we have our baguettes, we take a mistress, we enjoy ourselves, we drink some wine, and then it's over. Meaningless, meaningless. That's not what Solomon is plumping for here, right? He knows there's a God in heaven who somehow orders things. Ultimately, he's going to realize that, like Moses in Psalm 90, that God can, I think, establish our work in certain respects. But he is taking a sober look at the finitude of life and ultimately looking at how things unfold, and as a wise person who's been around the block once or twice, shrugging his shoulders and saying, what's the point? What's the point? And so Hebel isn't meaninglessness in the strict intellectual sense of modern atheism. It's this sense of fleetingness. And vanity is a pretty good way of capturing that. You remember the old King James, vanity of vanities. That's not bad at all. And the Greek translation of the Old Testament gives a word that can be translated futility. And I think that's a nice idea to capture what Solomon's getting at here. The transitoriness of life. The fact that it just literally, our labors and our lives run into the ground, gives a sense of futility to anybody who's really paying attention. Okay? So maybe God knows the ultimate answer. I think Solomon believed that. But from a human perspective, sometimes you just feel like, what's the point? God is, as it were, through Solomon, allowing our experience of the world into the canon of Holy Scripture to acknowledge the way we experience life in the world, right? So the Bible is not simply God saying, it's going to be all right in the end, so stop whining. He really does, even in His Word, allow the voice of people in their finitude, their frustration, and then even their futility, their sense of futility, to give voice to that. And notice Solomon's very first example. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go. The earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun sets, and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south, turns to the north, round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea. The sea's never full. The place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear of hearing. What has been will be again. What's been done will be done again. I just think of the T-shirt. Been there, done that. And then talks about accomplishments, of which, of course, Solomon had many. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself, planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them, made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees, bought male and female slaves, had other slaves who were born in my house, owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me, amassed silver and gold for myself, etc., 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 denied myself nothing. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. We're at the apex. When I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was a breath, chasing after wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. This sense of futility, which is, as we've seen now, wrapped up in our finitude, that we can take our limited existence not simply as a natural situation that arises in the presence of anything that's not God, but rather as a curse that frustrates us, and not simply a frustration that can be overcome, but at the end of the day, a frustration that leaves us shrugging our shoulders with Solomon at times and saying, what's the point? What's the point? And yes, there's that theological answer. Well, the point is that ultimately God works out his purposes, and that should give us a hope and a prayer that what we do can matter. But it doesn't take away the reality of our experience of frustration and futility. That's not a sign of absolute lack of faith or disobedience. It's a sign of what it is to live in a broken world.